47 people live on Pitcairn Island today, spread across a single village called Adamstown, reachable only by a supply ship that calls perhaps 4 times a year. They speak a language found nowhere else on Earth, a mixture of 18th century English and Tahitian called Pitcairn, and most of them share one of just a handful of surnames. Ask any of them where that language and those surnames came from, and the answer sounds almost like a legend. In 1789, the story goes, a group of British sailors mutinied against a tyrannical captain, sailed off in search of paradise, and found it on this speck of volcanic rock in the middle of the Pacific. It is a story that has been turned into novels and films for 2 centuries, usually ending somewhere around the moment the sailors and their Tahitian companions step onto the beach and begin a new life free of the Royal Navy's discipline. What the films tends to leave out is what happened next.
Within 10 years of that landing, 8 of the 9 mutineers who settled Pitcairn were dead, killed by each other or by the Tahitian men they had brought along and then betrayed. By 1800, exactly 1 adult man remained alive on the entire island, surrounded by widows, children, and the wreckage of a mutiny that had promised freedom and delivered something closer to a decade-long massacre. How that one surviving man turned a crime scene into one of the most devoutly religious and rigidly self-governing communities on the planet, and whether that community can survive at all into the coming decades, is the real story Pitcairn has to tell. It is also, as this channel has found with almost every small island it has covered, a story where the version people already know turns out to be only the opening chapter of something far stranger and far more consequential. To understand how 9 mutineers ended up on a 2-square-mile island, roughly halfway between New Zealand and South America, you have to start with the ship they abandoned. In late December, the His Majesty's armed vessel Bounty left England under the command of Lieutenant William Bligh, bound for Tahiti on a mission that sounds almost comic in retrospect, collecting breadfruit plants to transplant in the Caribbean as cheap food for enslaved plantation workers. The voyage out took 10 months, and by the time the Bounty reached Tahiti in October 1788, the crew had spent nearly a year at sea for the sake of a cargo of plants. They then spent 5 more months in Tahiti, waiting for the breadfruit saplings to mature enough to survive the return voyage. 5 months during which many of the sailors, including a young officer named Fletcher Christian, formed relationships with Tahitian women and grew increasingly reluctant to return to the discipline of a Royal Navy ship.
Contemporary accounts describe a crew that had essentially stopped behaving like naval personnel well before the mutiny itself, sleeping ashore against regulations, trading ship's nails and tools for food and companionship, and treating the Bounty increasingly as a temporary inconvenience, standing between them and a life they had already started building on land. Bligh, for his part, was neither the cartoonish sadist of later films nor a particularly gentle commander. Ship's logs describe a man given to explosive verbal tirades and public humiliation of his officers, but one who used the lash considerably less often than most captains of his era, a detail modern historians point to when weighing how much the mutiny was really about cruelty and how much it was about several dozen young men who had just spent 5 months living something close to a fantasy and did not want it to end. Bligh himself seemed genuinely blindsided by the mutiny when it came, writing later that he had considered Christian something close to a protégé, which suggests the breaking point had less to do with any single act of cruelty and more to do with the accumulated psychological gap between naval discipline and the life the crew had briefly tasted in Tahiti. Picture a young, able seaman we will call Thomas Pruitt, 22 years old, standing watch on the Bounty's deck in the pre-dawn darkness of April 28, 1789, 3 weeks after leaving Tahiti behind. Thomas had spent those 5 island months learning enough Tahitian to court a young woman named Tura, and he had spent the 3 weeks since departure watching Fletcher Christian grow visibly more desperate, sleeping poorly, snapping at junior officers, at one point reportedly building a makeshift raft in secret with the apparent intention of simply abandoning ship alone rather than sailing on to England.
When Christian and a group of armed sailors burst into Bligh's cabin that morning and dragged him on deck in his nightshirt, Thomas found himself facing a decision with no good options. Side with the captain and risk being killed by mutineers who already held the ship, or side with the mutiny and become, under British law, a capital criminal the instant he did so. He chose the mutiny, along with roughly 25 other men, while Bligh and 18 loyalists were forced into the Bounty's launch, a 23-foot open boat, and set adrift with minimal supplies. Bligh's subsequent achievement, navigating that overloaded launch nearly 4,000 miles to safety in Timor with the loss of only one man, remains one of the most remarkable feats of small boat seamanship in naval history, though it belongs to a different story than the one Pitcairn tells. For the mutineers, the celebration lasted about as long as it took to realize they had no safe place left to go.
Tahiti was the obvious refuge, and several men, including most of those who had not directly seized the ship, chose to stay there, gambling that a friendly island, a Royal Navy captain already knew well, was still safer than open rebellion at sea. Christian and 8 others disagreed, correctly guessing that the Royal Navy would eventually send a warship to Tahiti looking for exactly this kind of hiding place, which it did in 1791, hanging 3 of the mutineers who had remained behind. Christian's group instead searched the charts for somewhere the Navy would never think to look, and found it in an old, imprecisely recorded position for an island called Pitcairn, first sighted by a British ship in 1767, but plotted on most charts roughly 200 miles from its actual location, an error that would prove to be the single most important stroke of luck in the entire story. Along with the 9 British mutineers, the group that eventually settled the island included 6 Tahitian men and 12 Tahitian and Tubuaian women, most of whom appear to have had considerably less say in the arrangement than the mutineers themselves. A power imbalance that would help detonate the violence to come. Pitcairn was not actually Christian's first choice. The mutineers first attempted to establish a permanent settlement on Tubuai, an island roughly 500 kilometers south of Tahiti, arriving there in May 1789 and spending several months trying to build a fort and negotiate land with the local population. That attempt collapsed into open warfare within weeks, as disputes over land and women escalated into armed clashes that reportedly left dozens of Tubuaians dead. A preview in miniature of exactly the kind of conflict that would later destroy the settlement on Pitcairn itself. By September 1789, the mutineers abandoned Tubuai entirely, sailed back to Tahiti to collect additional Tahitian companions and supplies, and split into the 2 groups, those willing to risk staying in a place the Royal Navy already knew, and Christian's smaller group, determined to disappear completely. It is worth noting that the same underlying pattern, armed European men imposing themselves on a Polynesian population and treating land and relationships as simply available for the taking, produced violence at Tubuai before it ever reached Pitcairn, which suggests the eventual bloodshed on Pitcairn had less to do with the island itself and more to do with a template the mutineers had already established months earlier. They reached Pitcairn on January 15, 1790, found it uninhabited but scattered with the stone tools and abandoned garden terraces of a Polynesian settlement that had vanished centuries earlier, for reasons nobody on board could have known, and immediately set about making sure nobody could ever leave. Within days, the Bounty was stripped of anything useful, run aground in what is now called Bounty Bay, and deliberately burned to the waterline, both to prevent any mutineer from having second thoughts about sailing back into the arms of British justice, and to eliminate the one piece of physical evidence that could have proven exactly where the mutineers had gone. For a brief while, it must have looked as though the gamble had paid off completely. 9 British sailors and their Polynesian companions had an entire island to themselves, unclaimed by any European power, invisible on every accurate map, with fresh water, wild goats left decades earlier by a passing ship, and soil rich enough to grow yams, sweet potatoes, and breadfruit cuttings the Tahitians had brought along specifically for this purpose. The piece did not survive contact with the way the mutineers had structured their new society. Land on Pitcairn was divided among the 9 British men only, leaving the 6 Tahitian men as landless labourers working for Englishmen who had, in most cases, simply taken them along as forced or barely consenting labour rather than as equal partners in the settlement.
Picture one of those 6 men, a Tahitian we will refer to by the name recorded in surviving accounts as Ur, watching in 1790 as the British settlers assigned themselves the island's best garden terraces and left him and the other Tahitian men to clear rockier, less productive ground on the settlement's margins. Ur had left Tahiti believing he was joining a shared venture among equals, and instead found himself performing the heaviest agricultural labour on the island, while receiving none of the land ownership the British mutineers had claimed for themselves. Resentment over land, combined with disputes over the Tahitian and Tubuaian women, some of whom were reassigned between men after the deaths of their original partners, produced a slow-motion collapse into violence that modern accounts still struggle to fully untangle, since the only written record comes from the eventual survivors, who had every reason to shade their own roles favourably. What can be reconstructed with reasonable confidence is this. By 1793, the 6 Tahitian men, pushed to the edge by years of unequal treatment, killed 5 of the 9 British mutineers in a coordinated uprising, including Fletcher Christian himself, whose exact fate remains disputed between contemporary accounts, some claiming he was shot that day, and others suggesting he survived in hiding for years afterward. Ur himself was reportedly among those killed within the year that followed, caught in the second wave of retaliation, rather than living to see whatever future he had hoped for when he first agreed to leave Tahiti. The surviving British men and the Tahitian women then killed the Tahitian men in retaliation, either immediately or in the following months, until, by around, the killing had consumed nearly everyone involved in the original uprising on every side. Surviving accounts describe a final act of violence that year, in which the 2 last British men standing turned on each other, one shooting the other, over what witnesses later described only as a dispute that had been building for years, leaving Alexander Smith as the sole adult man left alive on the entire island. What remained by 1800 was a fractured household of Tahitian and Tubuaian women, roughly 24 children fathered by the dead mutineers, and exactly 1 adult British man still alive, a former gunner's mate named Alexander Smith, who had survived partly through the killing itself and, by most accounts, partly through simple luck of location during the worst of it. Smith was in his mid-30s, functionally illiterate by his own later admission, and now the sole adult authority over a community of women and children on an island with no ships, no law, and no possibility of outside help for years at a stretch. What he did with that position over the following decade is the part of the Pitcairn story that rarely makes it into the films at all, because it does not fit neatly into either a tale of paradise or a tale of horror. Smith taught himself and the children to read using the Bounty's salvaged ship's Bible and its Book of Common Prayer, essentially the only 2 books that had survived the burning of the ship,
and built almost entirely by improvisation, a small theocratic community organized around daily prayer, strict sexual morality, enforced with a severity that stood in stark contrast to the chaos of the previous decade, and a work ethic built around subsistence farming and fishing that left little room for the resentments that had destroyed the original settlement. Each morning reportedly began with Smith gathering the children, by then numbering close to 24, for scripture reading and prayer before the day's farming and fishing work began, a routine he maintained for years, with a consistency that later visitors found almost startling given his own admitted lack of formal education. He also imposed rules against alcohol production, reportedly after witnessing firsthand how drink had inflamed several of the disputes that led to the killings of the 1790s, a restriction some accounts credit as much as religion itself for the community's subsequent stability.
Whether Smith acted out of genuine faith, calculated self-preservation, or simple exhaustion with violence is impossible to determine with certainty from the surviving record. And later islanders themselves have offered all three explanations at different points. But the practical result was a community that, whatever its founders' true motives, functioned peacefully for the better part of 2 decades under his sole authority. By the time an American sealing ship, the Topaz, stumbled onto Pitcairn in February 1808, 18 years after the Bounty's arrival, and completely by accident while chasing seals through waters most captains avoided, its crew found something almost nobody in the outside world expected still existed. The Topaz's captain, Mayhew Folger, later wrote that he approached the island cautiously, uncertain whether it was inhabited at all, and was startled when a canoe carrying 3 young men who addressed him in fluent, if archaic, English paddled out to meet his ship before he had even confirmed a safe anchorage. Folger's own account describes his genuine disbelief on realizing these young men were the sons of bounty mutineers, long presumed lost or dead, a detail that made his eventual report back to naval authorities read almost like fiction to the officials who first received him. Alexander Smith, who had by then renamed himself John Adams, apparently believing it might soften any eventual reckoning with British authorities, presented the Topaz's captain with a thriving, devoutly Christian community of about 35 people, entirely fluent in English, entirely unaware that the war between Britain and revolutionary France had come and gone in the years since their isolation began, and entirely convinced, correctly as it turned out, that their extraordinary origin story would fascinate rather than horrify the wider world once it finally became known. Word reached Britain slowly, delayed further by the Napoleonic Wars, and when a Royal Navy captain finally visited in Tensach-Weissetset with formal authority to arrest the last surviving bounty mutineer for a 25-year-old capital crime, he took one look at the peaceful, prayerful, Bible-reading community Adams had built and simply chose not to make the arrest, reporting back to London that prosecuting an elderly patriarch presiding over a devout island of his own children and grandchildren would serve no purpose beyond cruelty. Adams lived out the rest of his life on Pitcairn as an unofficial community elder, dying peacefully in Tensach-Weissetset, the only one of the 9 original mutineers to escape violent death, and the only one whose choices, arguably, still shape how the island's descendants live today. It's worth pausing here on a connection to another island story this channel has already told, because Pitcairn and the Isle of Man arrived at radically different histories from a surprisingly similar starting question. How does an extremely small, physically isolated population govern itself without simply being absorbed or ignored by a larger power? The Isle of Man solved that question through Tynwald, the oldest continuously running parliament on Earth, a formal legislative body stretching back over 1,000 years to Norse settlers who needed a structure for resolving disputes among clans that could never fully dominate one another. Pitcairn solved the same underlying problem through something far more improvised and far more fragile: a single surviving authority figure who happened to choose religion and literacy over further violence, followed eventually by an elected island council with no formal constitution behind it until well into the 20th century. Both places prove that self-governance at a tiny scale can work for centuries. But Pitcairn's version was never backed by anything as durable as Tynwald's 1,000-year institutional memory. It was backed, at the start, by the personal choices of one traumatized survivor, which meant the entire system remained only ever as strong as whoever happened to be running it in any given generation. A vulnerability that would resurface with devastating consequences nearly 2 centuries later. Where Tynwald's authority rests on written law, precedent, and a body of representatives accountable to each other, Pitcairn's early governance rested almost entirely on the personal moral authority of whoever held the community's trust, an arrangement that worked remarkably well under Adams and later under a handful of similarly respected elected magistrates, but one that offered no real institutional check against a leader or a group of men who chose to abuse that trust instead of honoring it. The population grew steadily through the 19th century, reaching close to 200 people by the 1850s, a number that began to strain the island's limited farmland and fresh water to a genuinely dangerous degree. Visiting ship captains through the 1830s and 1840s consistently described a community that seemed, on the surface, to have solved problems entire nations struggled with. No recorded crime, no poverty in the conventional sense, universal literacy at a time when large portions of Britain's own working class could not read, and a level of communal cooperation on shared tasks like boat building and harvest that struck outside visitors as almost utopian. Language that fed directly back into the growing British and American fascination with the island as a real-life redemption story, rather than merely a footnote to a naval scandal. In 1856, the entire population, all 193 residents, was relocated by the British government to Norfolk Island, a much larger former penal colony thousands of kilometers to the west, in what officials hoped would be a permanent resettlement, solving Pitcairn's overcrowding once and for all. The move itself required 2 ships and took several weeks, and surviving letters from the relocated islanders describe genuine culture shock at the scale of Norfolk Island compared to the 2 square miles they had known their entire lives, along with unease at inheriting a landscape still scarred by the buildings and machinery of the brutal penal colony Britain had only recently closed there. Most of Norfolk Island's current population still descends from that migration, but within 2 years, 16 Pitcairn Islanders, homesick for the specific volcanic cliffs and coral coves of the island their families had known for 3 generations, sailed back to resettle Pitcairn itself, followed by another 27 families in re-establishing a permanent Pitcairn community that has continued in an unbroken line to the present day, even as Pitcairn's population never again approached its 1850s peak. The split between the 2 communities, one on Norfolk and one back on Pitcairn, has continued in a low-key way ever since, with occasional family reunions between the 2 islands serving as one of the only regular points of contact between descendants of the same 9 mutineers, now separated by roughly 5,000 kilometers of ocean.
The community's religious character shifted decisively in 1886, when an American Seventh-day Adventist missionary named John Tay arrived uninvited on a passing ship, spent 5 weeks preaching to islanders already primed by generations of Adams's biblical literacy, and converted the entire population to Adventism within that single visit. A transformation so complete and so immediate that Pitcairn remains almost entirely Seventh-day Adventist to this day, one of the only nations or territories on Earth where a single Protestant denomination claims nearly the whole population. The conversion brought with it a Saturday Sabbath, strict dietary rules against pork and shellfish that had to be reconciled awkwardly with an island economy built partly on fishing, and a renewed emphasis on biblical literacy that reinforced the pattern Adams had first established nearly a century earlier. A tiny, remote population organising its entire identity around Scripture, partly because Scripture was, for most of that history, nearly the only written material the island possessed. Tay's own account of the visit describes a population already so receptive to his message that he barely needed to argue for it, writing that the islanders seemed to be waiting for someone to formally organise a faith they had informally been practicing under Adams's influence for generations.
Within a year of Tay's departure, the island had voted, apparently unanimously, to adopt Seventh-day Adventism as its official and effectively only religion, banning the sale and consumption of alcohol outright, a prohibition that remained in force in various forms for well over a century afterward, and that some islanders still point to as a direct continuation of the same instinct that had led Adams to ban home-brewed spirits decades before Tay ever arrived. Picture a woman we'll call Hetty Christian, a fictional but historically representative descendant of the original mutineer families, standing on the jetty at Bounty Bay in Piat, watching a passing ocean liner's longboat approach through the surf, carrying mail, tinned food, and a handful of curious tourists willing to pay for a road excursion to shore, since Pitcairn had no harbour safe enough for the liner itself to dock. By the early 20th century, this had become the island's only reliable connection to the outside world. Ships passing through the South Pacific shipping lanes, slowing briefly to trade, collect mail, and let islanders sell hand-carved curios and the island's distinctive postage stamps, which had become surprisingly valuable among philatelists, specifically because Pitcairn issued so few of them, and because the story behind the island made every stamp feel like a piece of the bounty legend itself. Hetty's generation lived an economy almost entirely built around these irregular ship visits, supplemented by subsistence farming, fishing, and the sale of honey from hives established decades earlier, since the island's isolation that had once nearly destroyed the original settlers had, by the 20th century, become the very thing tourists and stamp collectors were willing to pay to feel connected to, however briefly. During the Second World War, Pitcairn's isolation briefly became a strategic asset rather than a curiosity, as the island hosted a small radio watch station monitoring Pacific shipping lanes for Japanese naval activity, staffed largely by islanders themselves, after Britain judged the population too small and remote to justify stationing regular military personnel there. The radio equipment installed for that wartime purpose remained the island's primary link to the outside world for decades afterward, gradually supplemented by shortwave communication that let islanders receive news and, eventually, place emergency medical calls without waiting for the next passing ship, a capability that mattered enormously on an island with no resident doctor and no realistic possibility of medical evacuation faster than whatever vessel happened to be nearby. That fragile equilibrium, a tiny population governing itself through an elected council, bound together by shared descent from 9 mutineers and their Polynesian companions, and economically dependent on the outside world's fascination with its own founding myth, concealed a darker pattern that finally became impossible to ignore at the turn of the 21st century. In Jevenutset Davidtid, a British policewoman stationed temporarily on Pitcairn to investigate an unrelated matter received a disclosure from a young island resident that opened into a far larger investigation, eventually revealing a pattern of sexual abuse of underage girls that had persisted across multiple generations on the island, extending back, by some accounts, for decades. The resulting prosecution, which formally opened in 2004, charged 13 men, roughly a third of the island's entire adult male population at the time, with offences including rape and indecent assault of children. Before the trial could even proceed, defence lawyers raised a genuinely novel legal question that had never been tested before: whether British criminal law applied to Pitcairn at all, since the island's unusual governing arrangements had never been fully codified in the 2 centuries since Adams first improvised them. Britain's Privy Council ultimately ruled that Pitcairn had remained a British territory since Tuestat Vetiset Vorsum, regardless of how informally it had been administered, clearing the way for the trial to proceed under English law. 7 men were ultimately convicted, including the island's mayor, in trials held partly on Pitcairn itself, in a specially constructed courtroom, and partly via legal proceedings in New Zealand, since Pitcairn had no prison of its own and had to build one specifically to hold the convicted men. A modest concrete facility completed only shortly before sentencing was handed down. The case forced an uncomfortable reckoning that historians and islanders alike still debate without full agreement. Some pointed to the extreme isolation itself, a community small enough that victims had nowhere to turn and no outside authority present for most of its history to intervene. Others pointed to Adams's original theocratic model, which had solved the violence of the 1790s by concentrating enormous, unchecked authority in a small number of men, a structural vulnerability that outlasted Adams himself by more than a century and a half. What is not in dispute is the scale of the disruption. With roughly a third of the adult male population convicted or imprisoned, an already tiny community lost a significant share of its working-age men, at precisely the moment global media attention made Pitcairn synonymous, for many people encountering the island's name for the first time, not with mutiny and paradise, but with the trial itself, a reputation the island has struggled to shift in the 2 decades since. Today, Pitcairn's population sits at roughly 47 people, down from a mid-20th century peak above 150, and the British government, which still administers the island as one of its last remaining overseas territories in the Pacific, has spent the years since the trial actively recruiting new settlers with offers of free land, hoping to reverse a demographic decline that threatens the island's basic viability as a functioning community within a generation or 2.
Pitcairn, the island's unique Creole language, is spoken fluently by a shrinking number of residents, most of them older, while younger islanders increasingly default to standard English, learned through satellite internet access installed in the 2010s, the same technology that finally gave Pitcairn reliable outside communication after more than 2 centuries of depending on passing ships. Picture a shopkeeper we will call Meralda Warren, a fictional but representative present-day islander, opening Adamstown's single small store on an ordinary Tuesday morning, checking the satellite forecast for the next supply ship, and fielding an online inquiry from a family in Britain asking serious questions about the island's free land resettlement offer. Meralda has lived through the period when Pitcairn's population fell low enough that basic services, teaching the handful of remaining schoolchildren, staffing the health centre, keeping the Longboat seaworthy, became genuinely difficult to sustain with the people actually available. She has also fielded, more than once, questions from journalists and curious strangers online who know the island only through the 2004 case, and has had to decide, as most of her neighbours have, how much of that history to explain to visitors and how much to simply let stand as a painful chapter the community would rather not relitigate with every new arrival.
Her daily routine, part shopkeeper, part unofficial ambassador for an island most of the world still associates primarily with either a Hollywood mutiny or a criminal trial, captures a tension the whole community now lives with, needing outside attention to survive economically and demographically, while remaining wary of exactly what that attention tends to focus on. Whether the island's population stabilizes, continues shrinking toward eventual abandonment, or grows again through the resettlement program remains genuinely unresolved. A question nobody, not the British government, not the islanders themselves, can currently answer with confidence. Stand today on the same jetty at Bounty Bay where Hetty's generation once watched longboats bring mail from passing ships, and the water below still hides, somewhere beneath the surf, whatever remains of the Bounty's burned hull after more than 2 centuries underwater.
The island above it holds a population smaller than most office buildings, still governed by an elected council, descended in a fairly direct institutional line from the arrangement John Adams improvised out of desperation in 1800. Still overwhelmingly Seventh-day Adventist, and still working through the aftermath of a crisis that exposed exactly how much can go wrong when a community's entire structure depends on the character of whoever happens to hold power in any given generation. The mutineers who burned their ship in 1790 wanted to disappear so completely that no one could ever find them or hold them accountable for what they had done. In the strictest sense, they succeeded, for 18 years at least, before an American sealing captain chasing seals stumbled onto their secret entirely by chance. What nobody involved could have anticipated is that their descendants would spend the next 2 centuries discovering, slowly and at real human cost, that isolation can protect a community from the outside world's judgment for a remarkably long time, but it cannot protect that same community from itself. 47 people now carry that inheritance forward, still bearing the surnames of 9 men who thought that burning a ship would let them escape their own history. It did not. It simply meant that history would have to be rebuilt, generation after generation, on an island with nowhere left to run.